My name is Luna. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I was described with words that sounded kind but felt limiting: quiet, reliable, easygoing. The kind of daughter who never caused trouble. The kind of woman who understood how the world works. I grew up in San Francisco, in a house that always smelled faintly of espresso and printer ink because my parents ran their company from the second floor. On the surface, we were a family built on ambition. My parents were respected entrepreneurs in the tech logistics space. We attended charity galas. We smiled in business magazines. I was often photographed beside them in structured dresses and neutral heels, well groomed, well behaved, well positioned. People assumed I was soft. They mistook my calm for compliance, my silence for agreement, my patience for a lack of depth. What they didn't see was that I've always been observant. I don't react quickly, not because I don't feel deeply, but because I need to understand the whole room before I move. I notice tone shifts, the way someone avoids eye contact when they're hiding something, the way a compliment can feel slightly transactional if you listen closely enough. For years, I believed my role in my family was simple: support, represent, never disrupt. Until the moment I realized I wasn't just supporting the company, I was being positioned. This story isn't about revenge. There are no screaming matches, no dramatic glass shattering confrontations, no sudden windfalls or miraculous rescues. What happened unfolded quietly, almost politely, which, in many ways, made it more devastating. I discovered that I was being offered, strategically, subtly, as leverage, a social bridge, a potential alliance, a solution disguised as a daughter. My parents' company was failing. Debt was tightening around them like an invisible wire. Investors were losing patience. And somewhere between closed door meetings and carefully arranged dinners, I became part of a negotiation I hadn't agreed to join. The realization didn't come with a single explosive reveal. It arrived in fragments. A comment that lingered too long, an introduction that felt rehearsed, a look exchanged across a dining table that wasn't meant for me to decode, but I did. When I understood the full picture, something inside me shifted, not in anger, not in heartbreak, in clarity. This is the story of how I moved from being the quiet, useful daughter to becoming the author of my own leverage. It's about emotional restraint, strategic silence, and the difference between being sacrificed and stepping aside before the altar is complete. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't villainize anyone. My parents believed they were surviving. The tycoon believed he was negotiating. And well, I believed I deserved agency. If you've ever felt like the reasonable one, the dependable one, the person everyone assumes will understand, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for permission? If you asked my parents who I was, they would smile before answering. "She's the steady one," my mother would say, with a tone that sounded like pride but felt like classification. My father would add, "Luna understands business. She doesn't get emotional." It was always framed as a compliment. In truth, I had been trained carefully to be steady. In a household where quarterly reports determined the mood at breakfast and investor calls could cancel birthdays, there wasn't much room for dramatic feelings. Success was oxygen. Stability was love. From the outside, I looked privileged. Private school education, international summer programs, An internship pipeline was already mapped out before I turned 18. I joined the company officially at 26 after finishing my MBA. The announcement post on LinkedIn described me as the next generation of visionary leadership. Inside the office, however, my role was narrower. I was the one who smoothed tense meetings, the one who rewrote aggressive emails into strategic diplomacy, the one who stayed late to prepare briefing folders for partnerships I wasn't allowed to negotiate. In boardrooms, I often sat slightly behind my father's right shoulder, not invisible, but not central either, close enough to whisper clarifications, far enough to never be the face of the decision. Investors liked me. They'd say things like, "You're different from your father, more measured," or "It's refreshing to see elegance in this industry." Elegance, measured, steady. No one ever said that. At family gatherings, relatives treated me like an accessory to our success story. "Luna will marry well," an aunt once joked, patting my arm as though discussing a promising stock. "She has the temperament for high-level circles." I laughed when I was supposed to. I'd mastered the art of appearing unbothered. But invisibility doesn't always feel like neglect. Sometimes it feels like safety. If you're not the loudest, you're not the target. If you're not the decision maker, you're not blamed. I told myself I preferred it that way. The truth is more complicated. There were moments, small, flickering ones, when I would draft a strategic proposal and watch it being presented by someone else. When I'd predict a partnership risk that was dismissed, only to see it materialize months later. In those instances, I would feel something rise in my chest. Not anger, recognition. I knew I was capable of more, but I had also internalized a belief. My value was in support, in refinement, in making other people look decisive. At home, the dynamic was even subtler. My mother would consult me on event guest lists. "Who should we seat next to the new investor?" she'd ask. "You're good at reading people." My father would request my presence at informal dinners with potential partners. "It softens the atmosphere," he'd say. "You bring balance." Balance softens. Even then, something about those words lingered longer than they should have. Because while I was positioned as balanced, I was never positioned as powerful. And I accepted that arrangement, at least consciously. It was easier to be indispensable than confrontational, easier to be relied upon than to demand recognition. I didn't feel mistreated. That's important. There was no cruelty, no shouting, no obvious manipulation, just a quiet pattern. I was most valued when I was useful, and usefulness, when repeated long enough, can start to resemble identity. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly I fit the role they needed. Polished, composed, socially adaptable, non-threatening. The kind of daughter who could sit across from billionaires and make them feel comfortable. The kind of daughter who wouldn't ask why she was always invited to certain meetings, but never to the final negotiation. At the time, I believed I was part of the strategy. I didn't realize I might be the strategy. The first time something felt wrong, it didn't arrive as a shock. It came as a sentence. We were hosting a private dinner at the Laurent, a quiet Michelin-starred restaurant my parents favored, when conversations required both discretion and spectacle. The lighting was low enough to flatter everyone. The wine list was long enough to imply power. The guest that evening was Daniel Rowe. Daniel wasn't just wealthy. He was infrastructure wealthy. Ports, shipping corridors, international warehousing contracts. His name carried weight in rooms that never made headlines. At that point, our company had already been experiencing what my father called temporary liquidity compression. I had seen the real numbers. It wasn't temporary, it was tightening. Still, I was told the dinner was simply exploratory. Be yourself, my mother said, as she adjusted the collar of my blazer in the reflection of our foyer mirror. Daniel appreciates intelligence. The way she said it sounded curated. Dinner was polite, controlled. My father discussed supply chain expansion. Daniel listened more than he spoke. My mother laughed at exactly the right moments. And Daniel asked me questions, not inappropriate ones, not personal, at least not at first. He asked about my MBA thesis, about brand perception in emerging markets, about why I believe long-term loyalty was undervalued in high-growth industries. I answered honestly. I enjoyed the intellectual exchange. It felt equal. Then, as dessert arrived, Daniel made a comment that shifted something invisible. You know, he said, swirling his wine, it's rare to see a family business where the daughter understands both optics and restraint. That combination is strategic. Strategic. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at my father, and my father smiled, not proudly, calculatingly. The conversation moved on. No one acknowledged the moment. But I felt it land somewhere deep and sharp, like a thin paper cut across skin you didn't realize was exposed. After dinner, as we stood on the sidewalk waiting for the car, my mother slipped her arm through mine. You were perfect tonight, she said softly. Perfect. For what? I didn't ask. Because technically nothing had happened. No proposal, no implication, no overt suggestion, just a word. Strategic. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's presence became consistent. Invitations to charity panels, private art previews, small investor roundtables where I was always included, even when my role didn't require it. You're building rapport, my father told me casually one morning. Relationships matter, I agreed. They did. But I began noticing patterns. If Daniel attended, I attended. If he declined, the event often disappeared from my calendar. Once, I overheard a phone call between my parents in my father's office. The door wasn't fully closed. Long-term stability, my father was saying. He values loyalty. My mother responded quieter. And legacy. A pause. Then, Luna makes that conversation easier. The air in my lungs felt thinner. Still, I rationalized. Of course, my presence helped. I was good at navigating personalities. I was diplomatic. I understood long-term branding optics. Didn't it mean what? That I was part of a negotiation? Was I a social asset, being positioned for emotional leverage? That felt dramatic, unfair, almost paranoid. So I dismissed it. The human mind is very skilled at protecting itself from conclusions that threaten stability. The second small cut came 2 weeks later. We were reviewing a restructuring document in the boardroom. Cash flow projections, debt extension contingencies. If Daniel entered as a majority investor, control distribution would shift significantly. I pointed to a clause. This term gives him veto power over future mergers. My father didn't look at me. He wouldn't exercise it irresponsibly, he said. That's not the point, I replied gently. The point is that he could. Daniel, seated across the table, smiled faintly. I appreciate caution, he said. It shows maturity. Again, maturity. Again, strategic. My father's tone changed subtly, softer, almost reassuring. Luna, he said, some partnerships require trust beyond paper. Beyond paper. I closed my notebook. It was the first time I felt something I couldn't neatly categorize. Not anger, not betrayal, displacement, as though a conversation was happening in layers, and I was only permitted access to the surface. That night, I lay awake replaying the sidewalk comment, the phone call, the veto clause, the word strategic echoes in different tones. I asked myself a simple question. If this were just business, why did my presence feel necessary in rooms where contracts, not branding, were being negotiated? And why did everyone look slightly relieved when I smiled? The first small cut didn't bleed, but it marked. The human brain is remarkably efficient at turning discomfort into routine. After the second boardroom meeting with Daniel, I told myself I was overanalyzing. High stakes negotiations create strange atmospheres. People speak in coded language. Strategic alliances blur personal and professional boundaries. That was normal, so I adapted. When Daniel texted to ask if I'd be attending a maritime sustainability panel, an event my role didn't require, I responded with polite affirmation. When my mother suggested a softer color palette for my wardrobe for upcoming dinners, I didn't question what those dinners implied. When my father began asking my opinion about Daniel's personal philosophy, I answered like a strategist, not a daughter. I became collaborative. That's how normalization works. It doesn't begin with force, it begins with gradual alignment. There was one evening in particular that crystallized the pattern. We were at a private investor retreat in Napa, the kind of place where the wine costs more than most people's monthly rent, and conversations about equity dilution happen beside infinity pools. I was seated between Daniel and a venture capitalist from Seattle. The conversation drifted towards succession planning, legacy structures, generational continuity. Daniel turned to me. Do you see yourself taking full control of the company one day? It was a fair question. On the surface, I answered carefully. Control isn't as important to me as sustainability. I care more about long term integrity than titles. He nodded approvingly. That's rare, he said. Ego ruins more businesses than debt. Then he added, almost lightly, it's good that you're adaptable. Adaptable. The word settled differently this time. Not strategic, not mature. Adaptable. Across the table, my father met Daniel's eyes briefly. A look passed between them. Subtle, wordless, familiar. And in that moment, I understood something. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel it in my spine. I wasn't being evaluated as a future CEO. I was being evaluated as a variable, a stabilizer, a bridge, a reassurance. The conversation shifted again. Laughter, investment projections, expansion corridors. No one acknowledged the undertone. On the drive back to the hotel, my mother leaned over from the front seat. Daniel respects you, she said warmly. He trusts your judgment. I looked out the window at the dark stretch of Vineyard Hills. Does he? I asked quietly. Of course, she replied. Men like him don't open up unless they see long term alignment. Long term alignment. It was phrased as reassurance. It sounded like positioning. That night, I opened my laptop and reread the preliminary investment draft. I wasn't searching for financial inconsistencies anymore. I was searching for language, clauses about family continuity, advisory roles, image preservation. There were no explicit conditions tied to me, no contract stating that my presence guaranteed capital infusion. And yet, the frequency of my involvement increased proportionally to the urgency of our cash flow crisis. Correlation doesn't equal causation, unless it does. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was temporary, that businesses go through phases, that strategic relationships sometimes require social nuance, that my parents would never intentionally commodify me. Intentional. That word became my shield. They didn't intend harm, they intended survival. And survival can justify many gray areas. Over the next month, Daniel began inviting me to one-on-one lunches, always framed as industry discussions. I accepted. I listened. I observed. He never crossed a line, never flirted overtly, never suggested anything personal. But he asked questions about my long-term plans. Do you ever think about building something separate from your family? Do you value independence? Do you believe loyalty should be rewarded? They were philosophical inquiries. They felt like vetting. Each time I returned home, my father would casually ask, "How did it go?" Not, "Did you enjoy yourself?" Not, "What did you think?" Just, "How did it go?" As though progress was being measured. And I participated in that measurement. I'd summarize Daniel's perspectives, his hesitations, his priorities. I was providing intelligence, without admitting that I might be part of the trade. The normalization wasn't loud. It was incremental. A seat at more tables, a voice in more conversations, an increase in praise when I performed emotional calibration effectively. "You're invaluable," my mother told me one evening. Invaluable. It's a beautiful word. Until you realize it might not be about your humanity. It might be about your utility. The third small shift happened internally. I stopped asking whether something felt wrong. Instead, I asked whether it was necessary. That distinction matters. Because once you start justifying necessity, you can tolerate almost anything. And I did, for a while. There's a quiet moment in every shifting dynamic when you stop pretending you don't see it. Not because someone confesses, not because there's proof laid out in black and white, but because the pattern becomes too symmetrical to ignore. For me, that moment happened on a Tuesday afternoon in our executive conference room. The kind of sterile glass-walled space where decisions are framed as inevitabilities. The company's financial pressure had intensified. Two major clients had delayed renewals. Our line of credit was nearly exhausted. The language in meetings had changed from expansion to stabilization. Daniel's investment proposal was no longer exploratory. It was central. My father stood at the head of the table, outlining revised terms. My mother sat beside him, her pen moving in small, controlled strokes. Daniel joined via video that day, his image sharp and composed on the large screen. I listened carefully as percentages were discussed. Board seats reallocated, voting structures recalibrated. Then my father said something that shifted the air. "We believe long-term alignment is our strongest asset," he said smoothly. "This isn't just about capital, it's about continuity." Continuity. Daniel's expression remained neutral. "And how do you define that?" There was a fractional pause. My mother answered this time. "Shared vision, shared values, shared future, shared future." My chest tightened. The words weren't directed at me, but they circled me. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Stability requires trust," he said. "Trust requires personal alignment." Personal, not operational. Personal. And suddenly, the past months rearranged themselves in my mind. Not as isolated events, but as deliberate positioning. The dinners, the retreats, the one-on-one lunches, the wardrobe suggestions, the repeated emphasis on loyalty, adaptability, and long-term thinking. I wasn't just being included, I was being displayed, not as bait, not as something crude, but as reassurance, an unspoken promise that Daniel's investment would anchor into something deeper than spreadsheets. Family core integration, legacy blending, social alignment. I had been assigned a role long before I understood the script. Reliable daughter, emotional stabilizer, potential bridge, and the brilliance of it was its subtlety. There was no contract stating I was part of the deal, no document outlining expectations of marriage or partnership. Just implication is layered carefully beneath business language. After the meeting ended, my father closed his laptop slowly. "This is delicate," he said, mostly to himself. I remained seated. "Are we negotiating equity?" I asked calmly. "Or integration?" He looked at me then, not sharply, not defensively, measured. "Both," he said. "In this tier of business, they're intertwined." My mother added gently, "Luna, no one is asking you to do anything. But relationships create stability. You understand that." I did understand. That was the problem. I understood that my presence reduced perceived risk, that my composure signaled cultural compatibility, that my education and temperament reassured Daniel that investing in our company meant investing in a cohesive ecosystem, not chaos. I understood that in rooms where billions move, emotional optics matter. What I hadn't fully accepted until that moment was this: I wasn't being asked, I was being assumed. Assumed to cooperate, assumed to align, assumed to prioritize the company's survival above my autonomy. Not because my parents were cruel, but because I had always been the one who understood. Understanding can become expectation. Expectation can become an obligation. That evening, I stood in my bedroom holding my silver fountain pen, the one object I'd kept since graduating from business school. It had my initials engraved into the metal: LAH, Luna Evelyn Hart. Not Hart Logistics, not Hart Row Alliance, just me. I stared at my reflection. For years, I had prided myself on being composed, on seeing the bigger picture, on not reacting impulsively. Now, I saw the bigger picture clearly, and it included me, not as a decision maker, not as a stakeholder, but as leverage. The realization didn't break me, it clarified me. There's a difference between being supportive and being positioned, between choosing loyalty and being maneuvered into it. That Tuesday, without confrontation, without raised voices, I understood the role I had been assigned. The question was no longer whether I could perform it. The question was whether I would. The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It didn't happen during a tense dinner or a strategically worded conversation. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning in the kitchen, with sunlight falling across the marble counter like nothing in the world was unstable. My parents were upstairs preparing for a brunch meeting with Daniel. I had declined the invitation the night before, claiming I needed to review campaign metrics. No one pushed back. That in itself was unusual. I stood alone with my coffee, staring at the company's internal financial dashboard on my tablet. Red indicators, deferred liabilities, a restructuring timeline that was far more fragile than my father publicly admitted. For months, I had been orbiting the crisis emotionally. That morning, I stepped into it intellectually. I opened the equity records, documents most people in the company didn't realize I had access to. Years ago, for tax efficiency and future succession planning, a percentage of shares had been transferred into my name. At the time, it had felt symbolic, a gesture. Now I examine the numbers more closely. My minority stake wasn't decorative. It was decisive, not enough to control the company alone, but enough to influence any majority shift, enough to complicate a clean takeover, enough to disrupt a seamless integration. My breath slowed. For the first time, I wasn't analyzing the situation as a daughter. I was analyzing it as a shareholder. I cross-referenced Daniel's proposed structure with my voting power. Certain clauses required supermajority approval. Certain governance changes could not proceed without my signature. And suddenly, something inside me rearranged. All these months, I had felt like the soft variable in the equation, the emotional component, the bridge. But legally, I was a gate. The realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. I set the tablet down and walked to the window. From there, I could see the upper balcony where my parents were speaking quietly. Their silhouettes moved in controlled gestures. They weren't villains, they were afraid. Fear makes intelligent people justify uncomfortable strategies. Fear convinces them that survival absolves subtle manipulation. And maybe they believed I would eventually see it as practical, a mutually beneficial alignment. But standing there with sunlight warming my face, I understood something that felt almost serene. They needed my cooperation, not my charm, not my presence, my signature. That was the moment something shifted. Not rebellion, not anger, distance, emotional distance. For years, my silence had been compliance. Now it became observation. I replayed every conversation in my mind, not as a daughter feeling displaced, but as a strategist reviewing positioning tactics. Daniel's philosophical questions about independence, my father's emphasis on continuity, my mother's subtle wardrobe suggestions. They weren't forcing me, they were nudging the narrative toward inevitability. And inevitability only works when the subject believes they have no leverage. I had leverage. I just hadn't been looking at it. A strange calm settled over me. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't cornered. I was underestimated. There's a unique power in being underestimated. People reveal more. They assume compliance. They build plans without reinforcing contingencies. I picked up my fountain pen and returned to the tablet. Instead of drafting emotional responses, I began outlining structural scenarios. If Daniel secured majority control without my support, what were the consequences? If I withheld approval, what alternative paths existed? If I chose to step away entirely, what would that trigger? The questions were no longer about how I felt, they were about how I would move. That Sunday, I didn't confront my parents. I didn't cancel future dinners. I didn't change my tone. I attended the next event exactly as expected. Composed, measured, observant. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer reacting to the story being written around me. I was assessing it, quietly, strategically. And for the first time, I stopped asking, why are they doing this to me? Instead, I asked, what are they assuming I'll never do? That question changed everything. There's a version of silence that comes from fear, and there's another that comes from decision. For most of my life, my quietness had been interpreted as gentleness. Even I had believed that. I told myself I avoided conflict because I valued harmony, that I chose diplomacy because I disliked unnecessary friction. But after that Sunday morning, my silence changed texture. It wasn't soft anymore, it was deliberate. The following week, Daniel invited me to a private maritime technology expo in Seattle. Normally, my father would have framed it as an important appearance. This time, he simply said, it would be beneficial if you attended. Beneficial, I nodded. Of course, and I meant it, because I needed more information. On the flight to Seattle, Daniel and I sat side by side in first class. He reviewed a briefing document while I looked out the window at the cloud line, stretching like untouched snow beneath us. He broke the silence first. You've been quieter lately, he observed. I turned toward him, calm. Have I? Yes, he said, studying me. More evaluative. The word almost made me smile. I've been listening, I replied. He held my gaze a moment longer than usual. Listening can be powerful. I know. There was no flirtation, no emotional charge. Just two people measuring each other in a language that didn't require raised voices. At the expo, I paid attention not to what Daniel said publicly, but to what he asked privately. He inquired about regulatory flexibility, about board compliance thresholds, about minority shareholder rights in family owned firms. Minority shareholder rights. The phrase echoed. He was assessing risk, and I was part of that risk. That realization didn't intimidate me, it steadied me. Back home, I began shifting small behaviors. I stopped volunteering insights unless directly asked. When my father sought updates from my lunches with Daniel, I offered summaries without emotional nuance. When my mother suggested another informal dinner, I agreed. But I no longer dressed to soften the room. I dressed like an executive. Structured lines, darker tones, less suggestion of approachability. No one commented on it directly, but they noticed. Silence unsettles people when they are used to access. One evening after a strategy call, my father lingered in my office doorway. "You seem distant," he said carefully. "I'm focused," I answered. He studied me, as if trying to determine whether focus was a threat. "We're close to stabilizing everything," he continued. "Once this is finalized, the pressure will ease." Finalized. Integration, disguised as stability. "I'm aware," I said. He nodded slowly, then left. That was the moment I understood something critical. They were relying on my predictability. They believed my loyalty would override any personal hesitation. They believed I would prioritize the company's survival the same way they did. And perhaps I would. But survival for whom? For the corporation? For their legacy? Or for myself? Silence became my advantage because it created informational asymmetry. They didn't know I had analyzed the voting structure in detail. They didn't know I had quietly consulted an external corporate governance attorney, framed as professional development advice. They didn't know I had reviewed the shareholder agreement line by line, marking clauses with my engraved pen. I wasn't planning destruction, I was mapping options. There's a profound difference. At the next board session, Daniel presented a revised investment timeline. He spoke confidently about alignment and future synergy. When the floor opened for comments, I waited. Let others speak first. Let assumptions solidify. Then I asked one question. "If structural control shifts," I said evenly, "how do you plan to protect minority autonomy in decision making that affects long term brand integrity?" The room went quiet. Daniel's expression didn't falter, but it sharpened. "That depends on cooperation," he replied. "Of course," I said gently. "Cooperation is mutual. No confrontation, no accusation, just clarity." My father glanced at me, surprised, not because of what I said, but because of how measured it was. That was the moment silence fully transformed. It was no longer compliance, it was positioning. When people believe you're passive, they expose their strategies more openly. They underestimate the threshold at which you might draw a boundary. And boundaries don't require volume, they require awareness. I continued attending dinners, continued smiling when appropriate, continued playing the role they had assigned me. But internally, I was no longer in that role. I was observing it from above, studying its weaknesses, waiting, not for revenge, for precision. Because once you understand that your silence is being mistaken for surrender, you have a choice, and I had made mine. The most powerful shifts are rarely visible. There were no dramatic exits, no sudden changes in tone. If anything, I became even more composed, more agreeable, more aligned. And that was exactly why no one noticed what I was doing. Preparation, when done correctly, looks like routine. I started with information. Every corporate structure has fault lines. Ours was no different. For years, my father had optimized the company for growth, aggressive expansions, leveraged credit, and ambitious acquisitions. It worked when capital was abundant, but leverage cuts both ways. I spent evenings reviewing past board minutes, tracing how voting thresholds had evolved over time. Certain amendments required unanimous consent among the founding shareholders. Others required only a supermajority. Most people never read governance documents until they're forced to. I read them like a map. I also scheduled quiet conversations, carefully framed, professionally justified. I met with the corporate governance attorney again, this time under the pretense of refining our compliance structure ahead of the investment. I asked precise questions. If a minority shareholder with meaningful equity withheld consent on a structural amendment, what would be the practical consequence? Delay, he answered. Negotiation, possibly restructured terms. Would that invalidate an investment? Not necessarily, but it complicates it. Complication. That word felt steady in my hands. I wasn't looking to sabotage. I was ensuring that any path forward required my explicit choice. Meanwhile, I began documenting patterns, not emotional grievances, strategic indicators, dates of meetings where my presence correlated with funding progress, language shifts in Daniel's proposals after our private conversations, instances where my father referenced long term alignment immediately following my public support at events. It wasn't about catching them, it was about understanding the architecture of influence. The more I mapped it, the clearer it became. My role wasn't incidental, it was stabilizing optics. Daniel trusted the company more when I was visible. Investors relaxed when I spoke about continuity. Even industry press framed our narrative as multi generational resilience. I had become the emotional hedge against risk, and no one had formally acknowledged it. That invisibility was my advantage. At a charity gala in late October, I tested something subtle. Normally, I would stand beside my parents during interviews, offering measured commentary about innovation and family values. That night, I excused myself early from the press cluster. Nothing dramatic, just a polite, I let my father elaborate. Within days, I noticed a shift. Daniel's assistant reached out to schedule a private dinner. My father asked if I'd felt unwell. Investors followed up for clarification on long term leadership vision. The system reacted to my absence, which meant my presence had weight. That confirmation changed the texture of my preparation. I began strengthening my independent positioning. I quietly updated my personal portfolio, refreshed connections outside the family business, scheduled exploratory conversations with venture partners unrelated to Daniel's network, not to escape, to ensure mobility. Leverage is meaningless if you have nowhere to stand. I also reviewed the original share transfer documents from years ago, the ones my parents had framed as symbolic succession planning. Buried within the structure was a clause neither of them likely considered relevant at the time. My shares could not be diluted without my written consent, not board consent, not a majority vote. Mine. That clause had once been a gesture of trust. Now it was structural gravity. Through all of this, I never altered my tone at home. At dinner, I asked about cash flow projections. I offered strategic branding suggestions. I accompanied my mother to one final informal gathering with Daniel's associates. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. The kind that doesn't require raised voices. The kind that reveals itself through the paperwork, through timing, through simple refusal to sign without alignment. One evening, Daniel asked me directly over dinner, "Do you believe in destiny within business partnerships?" I held his gaze evenly. "I believe in consent," I replied. He paused, just slightly. "Of course," he said, but I saw it then, the recalibration behind his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't entirely certain of my predictability. And unpredictability, when controlled, is power. What they never noticed was that I had stopped being the emotional variable. I had become the structural one, quietly, patiently, precisely. The full truth didn't arrive in a dramatic confession. It arrived in an email. It was sent late, 11:42 p.m., from Daniel's legal team to my father and mother. I wasn't included in the original thread. I only saw it because my father forwarded it to me the next morning with a simple note, "Review before noon." The attachment was titled Strategic Integration Framework, Revised Draft. Integration. Not an investment, not a partnership. Integration. I opened the document slowly, as if pacing could soften the content. The language was polished, clinical, elegant in the way high level corporate law often is. It outlined the phased capital infusion, the restructuring timeline, and the revised board allocation. Then I reached section 4.2, leadership continuity and cultural alignment provisions. My pulse didn't spike, it steadied. The clause described a long term relational synergy between founding family representation and principal investor interests to ensure cohesive governance and reputational stability. Relational synergy. Further down, it referenced anticipated formalization of strategic personal alliance as a confidence accelerator for full capital deployment. Formalization, personal alliance, confidence accelerator. There it was, not explicit, not vulgar, not binding, but clear. The final tranche of Daniel's investment, enough to eliminate our immediate debt exposure, was contingent upon demonstrated permanence of alignment between key stakeholder representatives. Key stakeholder representatives. That was me. I leaned back in my chair. There was no mention of marriage, no contractual obligation forcing a personal relationship, nothing legally coercive, just conditional enthusiasm. If alignment deepened, funding accelerated. If permanence materialized, control stabilized. It was written as optional. It functioned as an expectation. For months, I had suspected positioning. This was confirmation, not emotional speculation, structural reality. I closed my office door and reread the clause 3 times, not to absorb the insult, but to measure its design. Daniel hadn't demanded anything. He had incentivized it. My parents hadn't promised me. They had allowed the possibility, which meant they were willing to let ambiguity pressure me into compliance. No one had lied. They had simply avoided clarity. And ambiguity is often more powerful than force. I felt something then, but it wasn't rage. It was released. The quiet anxiety of uncertainty dissolved, because uncertainty can trap you in self-doubt. Clarity frees you. I forwarded the document to my personal governance attorney, not with outrage, but with a single question. Is my independent consent required for any provision under 4.2 to materially influence capital release? His reply came within an hour. Yes. If capital release is functionally tied to your relational status as a shareholder representative, your written approval or participation would be necessary to operationalize governance restructuring. Operationalize. In simpler terms, without me, the final funding could not be justified under the proposed narrative. Without my visible alignment, Daniel's confidence trigger would stall. Without my signature, the structure lacked cohesion. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the city skyline. Glass towers reflected late morning light, indifferent to private negotiations unfolding inside them. For the first time, I saw the full architecture. Daniel wanted risk mitigation, not just financially, but socially. A personal alliance with the founding family reduced volatility. It secured loyalty. It simplified optics. My parents wanted survival, and I had become the bridge between those desires. Not because I was weak, because I was reliable. The most painful realization wasn't that they were willing to use me. It was that they trusted I wouldn't resist. That trust, misplaced as it was built on a lifetime of compliance. I returned to my desk and opened a blank document. Instead of drafting confrontation, I drafted conditions. If I were to consider any structural alignment, business or personal, it would be on my terms. Transparent governance, independent board oversight, explicit separation between personal status and capital release, and most importantly, no ambiguity. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to clarify. Quiet dominance doesn't humiliate, it defines. That afternoon, my father stepped into my office. Well, he asked. I met his gaze calmly. The structure assumes my participation, I said evenly. That assumption needs to be addressed. He hesitated, just briefly. It's not an obligation, he replied. I know, I said. That's what makes it strategic. He didn't argue, because he understood that I understood. The private reveal wasn't about discovering betrayal, it was about discovering leverage. Not emotional leverage, structural leverage. And once you see your position clearly, the next move becomes less about reaction and more about the decision. Clarity simplifies everything, not emotionally. Structurally, once I understood that the final capital infusion hinged, quietly, politely, on my visible alignment, the situation stopped feeling personal. It became architectural. There were three paths in front of me. The first was compliance. I could lean into the narrative, allow the strategic personal alliance to mature organically under gentle encouragement. Let ambiguity carry the weight of expectation. Smile at the right events. Continue building rapport with Daniel until permanence feels inevitable. The company would stabilize, my parents would be relieved, and I would become a symbol of resilience, folded neatly into a merger disguised as destiny. The second path was confrontation. Expose the implicit condition. Challenge the ethics of tying capital acceleration to relational optics. Force Daniel to remove the clause publicly. Demand that my parents separate family from finance. That path would feel righteous. But righteousness often burns more than it builds. It would fracture trust, possibly collapse negotiations, accelerate the very bankruptcy my parents feared, and it would transform me into the obstacle. The third path was quieter. Refusal, without spectacle, not a dramatic rejection, not emotional withdrawal, but structural non participation. I could decline any narrative that linked my personal alignment to funding momentum. I could withhold consent on governance amendments that implied relational permanence. I could redefine the company's stability around operational value, not my existence. The company might still receive partial funding, Daniel might still invest, but the acceleration trigger would vanish, which meant the deal would either stand on merit or unravel on its own. I spent 2 days alone with that choice. No late night calls, no strategic rehearsals, just long walks along the Embarcadero, watching cargo ships move slowly through the bay, massive, deliberate, unhurried. I asked myself one question. If I remove myself from the equation, does the business still make sense? Because if it doesn't, then it was never stable to begin with. On the third morning, I drafted an email to Daniel directly. Not emotional, not accusatory, precise. I've reviewed section 4.2 of the revised framework. I would like to clarify that my personal affiliations will remain independent from corporate capital triggers. Any governance restructuring must stand independently of relational status. I'm prepared to support operational alignment where it serves long term integrity. I'm not available as a confidence accelerator. I reread the final sentence 3 times. Then I removed the metaphor. Clarity doesn't require cleverness. I rewrote it. I will not participate in any structure where my personal life is implicitly tied to capital deployment. Simpler, clean, irreversible. Before sending it, I walked upstairs to my parents' private sitting room. They were reviewing cash flow projections, their voices low and tense. I'm making a decision, I said calmly. They both looked up. I'm separating my personal autonomy from the investment structure. Completely. My mother's expression flickered. Not anger, but fear. That could complicate things, she said softly. Yes, I agreed. My father stood slowly. We're close, Luna. This stabilizes everything. For whom? I asked gently. Silence. I'm not opposing the investment, I continued. I'm opposing ambiguity. If Daniel believes in the company, he'll invest without relational contingencies. If he doesn't, then this was never about governance. You're risking acceleration, my father said. I'm protecting clarity. There was no shouting, no ultimatums, just a quiet line drawn in language. Back in my office, I sent the email. No dramatic music, no shaking hands, just a click. Within hours, Daniel replied. Understood. Let's discuss structural alternatives. No anger, no threat, just recalibration. That was the moment I knew I had chosen correctly. Because if his interest had been contingent solely on access to me, the tone would have shifted. Instead, it sharpened, business returning to business. The final decision wasn't about rejecting him. It was about rejecting the premise that I was leveraging. And once that premise dissolved, the negotiation transformed, not into hostility, into equilibrium. For the first time since this began, the company's future would rise or fall on numbers, strategy, and governance, not on my adaptability. The decision point didn't explode. It clicked into place, quietly, permanently. After the email, I didn't wait for reactions. I moved. Quiet dominance isn't about making declarations and hoping others adjust. It's about reinforcing your position before anyone fully understands that you've shifted it. Daniel requested a private meeting 2 days later. Neutral location, no parents, no board. We met in a glass walled conference room overlooking the bay. Midday light, no dramatic shadows. He didn't waste time. You've altered the trajectory, he said evenly. I clarified it, I replied, a faint smile. Fair. He placed a revised document on the table. Section 4.2 had been rewritten. No relational language. No cultural permanence phrasing. The capital release schedule was now tied strictly to operational milestones. Debt restructuring completion, client retention thresholds, and performance benchmarks. Business. Clean. But there was a difference in pacing. The final tranche would now be delayed by 6 months. Acceleration removed. 6 months is a long time in our position, I said calmly. It's the cost of structural purity, he replied. Translation. If I removed myself as a confidence variable, the risk premium returned. I nodded. Then we'll meet the milestones. No emotion, no resentment, just alignment. That afternoon, I began reinforcing the company internally. If funding were to now hinge on performance metrics, then performance needs to be tightened immediately. I initiated a brand repositioning campaign focused on reliability over expansion, reduced public growth promises, shifted narrative from aggressive scale to disciplined resilience. I called our top 3 clients personally, not as a daughter, not as an accessory, but as director of strategy. I addressed renewal hesitations head on, offered revised terms that prioritized stability over short term margin. No one knew the real reason for my urgency. They only saw precision. Simultaneously, I exercised a quiet but powerful step. I formally requested an independent board observer, an external governance advisor to sit in on restructuring discussions, framed as transparency enhancement. In reality, it ensured no future clauses would hide behind poetic language. My father hesitated. Is this necessary? He asked. Yes, I answered. He studied me for a long moment. Then he signed. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly, not cold, cautious. My mother watched me more carefully. My father spoke to me less about social alignment and more about cash flow ratios. They understood the ground had changed, but they also understood something else. I hadn't attacked them. I had strengthened the structure. Daniel, for his part, recalibrated too. Our conversations became strictly operational. He challenged projections. I countered with data. We debated logistics contracts like equals. There was no mention of destiny, no philosophical inquiries about loyalty, just spreadsheets. And in that neutrality, something surprising emerged: respect, not romantic tension, not emotional chemistry, professional respect, the kind that only exists when both sides know the other cannot be maneuvered easily. Meanwhile, I continued building my independent positioning. I formalized a side advisory role with a small sustainability startup, completely unrelated to Daniel's network. Not publicized, just documented. Mobility maintained. If the company survived, it would be because it deserved to. If it failed, I would not collapse with it. That distinction gave me calm. Weeks passed. Performance metrics improved incrementally. Clients renewed cautiously. Internal morale stabilized under clearer messaging. The delayed funding tranche remained pending, but no longer fragile, because it wasn't tied to me, it was tied to execution. One evening, as we reviewed updated projections, my father looked at me differently. Not as a softening presence, not as an emotional buffer, as a strategist. You handled this correctly, he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Moving in silence had achieved what confrontation never could have. It shifted the center of gravity. The company was no longer negotiating through me, it was negotiating through competence. And I was no longer being positioned. I was positioning, quietly, precisely, without spectacle. Consequences don't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes they arrive like silence in a room that used to feel predictable. 6 weeks after the revised agreement, the first shift became visible. Daniel postponed a public announcement that had been tentatively scheduled, an event that would have framed the investment as a transformational alignment. The press release draft was quietly shelved. No explanation was given externally. Internally, everyone felt it. My father pretended it was strategic timing. Markets are volatile, he told the executive team. Better to move carefully. But careful wasn't the original plan. Acceleration had been. Now, acceleration was gone. Cash flow remained tight. We weren't collapsing, but we weren't rescued either. The 6 month milestone window loomed like a measured countdown. People began working differently: tighter budgets, harder negotiations, more scrutiny on expense lines that once passed unquestioned. For years, the company had relied on optimism as fuel. Now it relied on discipline. And discipline is less glamorous. One afternoon, our CFO approached me privately. Daniel's team is asking for deeper performance reporting, he said. Weekly instead of monthly. That's reasonable, I replied. He hesitated. It's more pressure. Yes, I agreed. But it's clean pressure. He studied me, perhaps sensing there was context he didn't have access to. There was. The removal of relational leverage meant Daniel's risk exposure had increased. Without perceived personal integration, he required harder data, stronger proof. He was no longer investing in emotional continuity. He was investing in metrics, and metrics demand effort. At home, the atmosphere shifted further. My mother began hosting fewer social dinners. Invitations from Daniel's circle slowed. The soft choreography of integration dissolved almost imperceptibly. No one said why, but everyone knew. One evening, I overheard my parents speaking in low voices again. This would have been easier, my mother murmured. Yes, my father replied. A pause. But it's stronger this way. That sentence lingered. Stronger. The irony wasn't lost on me. The path they had considered simpler, subtly aligning me with capital, might have produced faster relief, but it would have embedded fragility beneath it. Now, every dollar would rest on performance. Every decision would stand independently. There's a cost to autonomy. It's an effort. Daniel too adjusted. In meetings, he challenged assumptions more aggressively. He questioned growth forecasts. He requested independent audits of certain projections. There was no hostility, just rigor. And with rigor came something else: distance. We no longer had private dinners, no philosophical conversations, no subtle testing of emotional alignment. Our interactions became sharp and professional. In a strange way, that clarity felt cleaner than anything before. Still, consequences ripple beyond boardrooms. Investors who had anticipated a swift stabilization grew restless. Some quietly reduced exposure. Minor partners who once leaned on Daniel's presumed confidence began hedging. The company wasn't unraveling, but it was being tested. And I felt the weight of that test, not as guilt, but as awareness. My decision had removed a shortcut. Shortcuts are tempting in a crisis, but they rarely build foundations. One late night in the office, as I reviewed revised projections alone, my father entered quietly. He didn't sit, he stood across from my desk. You know, he said, there was a time when I believed survival justified any alignment. I looked up. And now? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Now I'm learning that stability forced through personal compromise isn't stability. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was evolution. The consequences weren't catastrophic. They were clarifying. The company began shedding illusions. Operational inefficiencies were addressed directly. Board discussions became sharper. My role transformed organically. Not because I demanded it, but because I demonstrated it. When pressure increases, performance reveals hierarchy. And quietly, without announcement, my voice carried more weight. Not because I was positioned, because I was proven. The consequences had begun. Not destruction, refinement. But refinement requires endurance, and endurance would soon be tested further. Pressure exposes fault lines. 3 months into the revised structure, the market shifted. A major logistics contract, one we had counted on to stabilize Q4, was unexpectedly delayed due to regulatory review overseas. It wasn't catastrophic, but it tightened our margin at exactly the wrong moment. Daniel's final tranche was still tied to milestone thresholds, and now those thresholds looked fragile. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 a.m. The room felt colder than usual, though the temperature hadn't changed. Our CFO projected updated numbers onto the screen. If the contract clears within 60 days, we remain within acceptable variance, he explained. If it extends beyond 90, we breach covenant comfort. Comfort, corporate language for panic. Daniel attended in person. He listened without interruption. My father presented contingency plans, cost reductions, deferred expansion, and asset liquidation possibilities. His voice was steady, but I could see the strain around his eyes. At one point, Daniel leaned forward. If relational integration had proceeded, he said evenly, confidence velocity would be higher right now. The room went silent. It wasn't an accusation, it was observation, a reminder of the path not taken. My mother's fingers tightened around her pen. My father didn't respond immediately. I did. Confidence velocity based on optics is temporary, I said calmly. Operational velocity is durable. Daniel held my gaze. Durable takes time, he replied. Yes, I said. And time is honest. No raised voices, no defensiveness, just truth placed carefully between us. The meeting ended without resolution. The board agreed to tighten operations further and await regulatory updates. But something subtle shifted in the days that followed. Not in Daniel, in my parents. For the first time, I sensed doubt. Not about the business strategy, but about the decision to remove me from the equation. Not because they wanted to sacrifice me, because the alternative would have been easier. Easier is seductive in crisis. One evening, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen island. No spreadsheets, no projections, just quiet. You understand, she said softly, that if we had accelerated the alignment, the market might feel more secure. I met her eyes. Yes, she hesitated, and that security could protect employees, families, years of work. There it was, the moral weight. I didn't flinch. Security built on implication, I replied gently, is fragile. If the company needs my personal life to appear stable, then we never had stability. Her eyes shimmered, not with anger, but with exhaustion. We're close to the edge, she whispered. I know, I said. And I did. The pressure wasn't abstract anymore. Payroll cycles, vendor negotiations, employees who had mortgages and children and no insight into the structural negotiations unfolding above them. This wasn't ego. This was livelihood. For a brief moment, just one, I questioned myself. Had I overestimated the company's resilience? Had my insistence on structural purity removed a buffer we genuinely needed? The doubt lasted less than an hour. Because doubt rooted in fear often points toward compromise. And compromise, when it erodes autonomy, doesn't disappear after the crisis passes. It becomes precedent. The regulatory delay stretched into its ninth week. The board reconvened. Daniel spoke plainly this time. If performance milestones are missed, the final tranche will require renegotiation. Renegotiation, translation, harsher terms. My father nodded slowly. We understand. There was no anger, no plea, just gravity. And in that gravity, something irreversible crystallized. Even if my parents now wished they had leveraged me more aggressively, it was too late. The structure had been rewritten. The public narrative had shifted. The integration optics had dissolved. You can't reintroduce ambiguity once clarity has been declared, not without exposing intention. And intention, once exposed, fractures trust permanently. The path forward would now depend entirely on execution. No emotional accelerators, no relational assurances, just numbers. After the meeting, Daniel lingered. You made this harder, he said quietly. Not accusatory, observational. I made it cleaner, I replied. He studied me. And if the company doesn't survive, I didn't hesitate. Then it won't be because I was unwilling to be leverage. Silence settled between us, not hostile, respectful. Too late to fix it. Not because I had destroyed something, because I had removed the illusion that something else could fix it. Now, the outcome would be real, and real outcomes don't bend for convenience. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No slammed doors, no shattered glass, no raised voices echoing down marble hallways. Just three people sitting at a dining table that had hosted dozens of carefully orchestrated conversations, this time without pretense. It was late. The house was quiet. No assistants, no calls scheduled, no performance required. My father began. We need to speak plainly. I nodded. My mother folded her hands, the same way she did before high stakes investor pitches. There was a moment, she said carefully, when we believed that deeper alignment with Daniel would create security. Not because we valued the company more than you, but because we believed you were strong enough to carry it. Strong enough to carry it. That was the justification. Not that I was disposable, that I was capable. I know, I said. My father looked at me directly. We never intended to force you. You didn't, I replied. That clause, he continued, was a contingency, an option. For you, I said gently. Not for me. Silence. The truth doesn't need volume. It only needs space. My mother's voice softened. Do you believe we would have sacrificed your happiness? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I believe you convinced yourselves it wouldn't feel like sacrifice. Her breath caught slightly. That was the first real crack. Not anger, but recognition. For months, the tension had lived in implication, in unspoken positioning, in carefully curated environments. Now it sat plainly between us. You've changed, my father said. Yes, I agreed. How? I didn't answer immediately. I stopped trying to be useful, I said finally, and started trying to be responsible. Responsible to whom? He asked. Myself. The word landed heavier than any accusation could have. My father leaned back in his chair, absorbing it. For years, he said quietly, I believed loyalty meant alignment. And now? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Now I see that alignment without consent isn't loyalty, it's pressure. There it was. Not apology. Understanding. My mother reached across the table, not dramatically, just enough for her fingertips to rest near mine. We were afraid, she said. I know, afraid of losing everything. I know. And you weren't, she asked softly. I was, I admitted, but not enough to lose myself. No one spoke for several seconds. The air didn't feel explosive. It felt settled, like a storm that had passed without destruction. Just rearrangement. My father straightened. The company may survive, he said. It may not, but if it does, it will stand differently now. Yes, I said. And if it doesn't? My mother asked. Then we'll rebuild, I replied, without bargaining pieces. That was the closest we came to confrontation. No tears, no shouting, no dramatic ultimatums. Just three adults acknowledging a boundary that should have been clearer from the beginning. As I stood to leave the table, my father said something that stayed with me. I underestimated you. I paused. No, I said gently. You relied on me. There's a difference. Underestimation dismisses. Reliance assumes compliance. And compliance is what I had quietly removed from the equation. That night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Confrontation without heat doesn't burn bridges, it redefines them. The dynamic between us would never return to what it was. But it didn't need to, because for the first time, I wasn't positioned within their strategy. I was standing beside it, and that changes everything. The company survived. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, but steadily. The delayed contract cleared in the 11th week. We met our performance thresholds, barely, but honestly. Daniel released the final tranche without ceremony. No gala, no press spectacle, just a signed document and a wire transfer tied to audited milestones. The structure now is cleaner than it has ever been. Independent oversight is permanent. Governance language is precise. There are no poetic clauses about continuity disguised as alignment. Capital moves when numbers justify it. And I move differently too. I still sit in boardrooms. I still attend investor meetings. But I no longer sit slightly behind anyone's shoulder. My chair is positioned at the table, not because I demanded it, because I earned it. Daniel and I maintain a professional relationship. Measured, respectful, bounded. There is no tension, no unfinished narrative. We collaborate when necessary, disagree when appropriate, and leave personal speculation outside the room. What changed most wasn't the structure, it was my identity inside it. For years, I believed strength meant being the stabilizer, the one who absorbed pressure quietly, the one who adapted fastest, the one who understood without needing explanation. Now I understand something deeper. Stability that requires self-erasure isn't strength. It's negotiation. And negotiation should always be mutual. My relationship with my parents is quieter now. Not distant, but recalibrated. They ask instead of assume. They inform instead of position. When strategic discussions arise, my autonomy isn't implied. It's acknowledged. Trust rebuilt. Not because we avoided conflict, but because we survived clarity. I still carry the silver fountain pen, but it feels different in my hand. Before, it symbolized preparation, precision, the ability to articulate ideas elegantly. Now, it symbolizes consent. I sign what I choose, nothing more. Sometimes, I think back to the early dinners, the subtle compliments, the word strategic drifting across candlelit tables. I don't feel anger. I feel recognition. I see a younger version of myself, capable, intelligent, quietly ambitious, but still equating usefulness with worth. That version of me believed that being indispensable guaranteed safety. This version understands that being irreplaceable is different from being autonomous. The world still perceives me as composed, measured, diplomatic. They're not wrong, but they're incomplete. Because calm does not mean compliant, silence does not mean surrender, and loyalty, when chosen freely, carries far more weight than loyalty assumed. If the company had collapsed, I would have walked away intact. If it thrived, which it now cautiously does, I remain intact. That was always the point. I am not the sacrifice. I am not the leverage. I am not the bridge unless I choose to be. I am a shareholder, a strategist, a daughter, a woman who understands the difference between support and substitution. And most importantly, I am no longer available as an unspoken contingency. When I first realized I was being positioned as leverage, I thought the story would end in rupture, in anger, in exile, in dramatic separation. It didn't. It ended in definition. There's a quiet lesson hidden inside situations like mine, ones that don't look abusive from the outside. No cruelty, no shouting, no overt betrayal, just strategic silence layered over familial love. Sometimes the most dangerous sacrifices aren't demanded, they're assumed. You're not pushed toward the altar, you're gently steered there with compliments about your strength, your maturity, your adaptability. And because you are strong, because you are capable, because you have always been the steady one, you almost say yes without realizing what you're giving up. That's what nearly happened to me. Not because my parents didn't love me, but because fear can make intelligent people rationalize gray areas. They weren't trying to trade me, they were trying to survive. And in their survival mindset, I became a solution. Here's what I learned: you can love your family deeply and still refuse to be their contingency plan. You can protect a business without offering your autonomy as collateral. You can remain calm without remaining compliant. Quiet dominance isn't about crushing anyone. It's about standing so clearly in your boundaries that the structure has to adjust around you. When I removed myself from the equation, everything became harder in the short term. But it also became real. The company survived on merit. Our relationship survived on honesty. And I survived without fragmentation. If I had agreed silently, maybe the transition would have been smoother, faster, more socially elegant. But I would have always wondered whether I was chosen or positioned. And that question corrodes slowly. So if you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the dependable one, the reasonable one, the emotionally stable one everyone assumes will understand, I want to ask you something gently. Are you being appreciated? Or are you being relied on in ways you never consented to? There's a difference. And the difference is where your power lives. You don't have to shout to reclaim it. You don't have to humiliate anyone. You don't even have to walk away. Sometimes, all it takes is one clear sentence: I am not available for that. That sentence changed my life. Not because it ended everything, because it clarified everything. If you've ever found yourself positioned as the solution to someone else's crisis, what did you do? I'd really like to hear your story in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.